Hello, and welcome to a special edition of my Nagging Thoughts. I'm here with author Jen Grice. She wrote the book, You Can Survive Divorce. And today we're going to be discussing the wrong ways that women give headship. So before we get into that, I'd like to hand it over to Jen. And why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your ministry?
Well, thank you for having me, Giselle. I appreciate the invite and sharing my wisdom with your listeners and watchers. I'm Jen Grice, author of the book, You Can Survive Divorce, like you said. I am a Christian divorce mentor and empowerment coach. I basically guide women through their divorce, help them survive, and learn to be stronger after through boundaries and empowerment and that sorts of things. I have a YouTube channel. I have my own website, jengrice.com, and I also write for Christian websites like crosswalk.com and ibelieve.com.
That's fantastic. And I love the work that you're doing. It's wonderful. So I just pray that God continues to bless it and all that you're doing, and that it blesses the people that are on the receiving end of it as well. What comes to your mind when you hear this question? What are some of the wrong ways that women give headship?
Well, I think some of the things that I have seen in my ministry, divorcing Christian women or Christian women who are divorced who are healing after their abusive or toxic marriage, I see a lot of that they put their husband in a superior role, even over God in some cases. Right. And so the headship of their home was the husband, and they were the inferior one, the weaker one. And sometimes even women, and I know even in my own marriage where I put my husband in that place, it's not like he was demanding to be put in that place. It was something that I felt that was right from what I learned through different Christian resources, that I was supposed to be the helpmate or the helpmeet, and that it was his job to lead her home. And when he didn't lead her home, I kind of like tried to force him into that position.
That's really interesting, because this is really what I wanted to examine, because when I was going through my Christian marriage counseling to try to save my marriage, there were so many undercurrents of all of this marriage doctrine and theology that I was beating myself up with, that wasn't necessarily coming at me head on in a direct manner. Not to say that it didn't, because at times it did, but because I was already beating myself up and oppressing myself within my spirit with this theology, it didn't take much for any outside influence to just utterly crush my spirit. So one of the things, just listening to what you just said, that came to my mind is, what do you think it means to be equally yoked? Because, you know, the scripture says that we're supposed to be equally yoked, and a yoke is something that you put on, you know, two animals really to like plow a field together. So let me just ask you that, like, in terms of this headship theology, and how do you see that fitting with being equally yoked?
I think for myself, I heard it, you know, early in my marriage that meant that we were supposed to be Christians. And because my ex-husband said he was Christian, I assumed that meant we were equally yoked. But obviously, after we had been married a few years, and I realized that wasn't necessarily the case, that we weren't in the same, I wouldn't say level, I'm not the word I'm looking for, but there was a definite difference in our beliefs and our belief system and the base of our, you know, Christian faith. And I've also learned since my divorce, obviously doing a lot of research, reading the Bible several times, and just really studying the Word, that it also means that there's inequality between the parties when, you know, two animals are pulling and plowing the field. It's not like one is dragging the other. and this could go both ways in a marriage, where the husband is dragging the wife or the wife is dragging the husband, that they are equals both spiritually, emotionally, physically, and all those things that come with a good, healthy marriage. You get an unhealthy marriage, and I'm sure this is where women, could get it wrong, is when they think that one is superior over the other, and that the other one is incapable, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And so for me, what you're talking about is that, there's a lot of confusion there, or at least for me, there was a lot of confusion when I was married, because you hear a lot of rhetoric that says, of course you're equal, you're ontologically equal, God, sees you as equal. However, functionally, your role is less than, but it's not less than. That's only your, emotional baggage that sees it as less than. But, he's going to serve all the executive functions, and you're going to do, everything he says or whatever. And, it's not as plain as that, but that's, like the essence of it. It's like this crazy making, it's like theology where it's like, okay, you guys are equal partners so that you're equally yoked, pulling the same thing together in the same direction. But then they're like, no, in reality, you're a dog sled team, and there's a lead dog and then there's a following dog, and you're harnessed together. But to your point, if you have somebody who you're being told has to lead and they're not leading, how did you said you tried to force it. Like, how do you, as somebody who's like attached in the rear as a sled dog, get somebody else to lead?
Well, I think it's merely impossible. I mean, because they're not going to do, that's kind of like pulling a mule, or, pushing a mule. That's, almost impossible to do. I think, in a healthy marriage, two people are bringing to the table the same amount of, force and energy, and doing so because they want to please God, not because they're trying to fill a duty or look good to other people. On my channel, I talk a lot about narcissists, and in a narcissistic marriage, the narcissist projects an image of how they want their marriage to look, but in reality, there's a different dynamic going on in the home than what he's, displaying, and women can be narcissists too. So I just use the word, the pronouns he, but when you realize that you can't force somebody to do something that they don't want or that they're not doing, you have to kind of just give up. And that's where I see women, at least in my ministry, that have just kind of given up and realized, that they just can't do it anymore, that they have to seek other options like divorce.
And this is what was really profound to me, is that, before I got divorced, I was definitely one of these, divorce is not an option, like I'm not, like the world, and I'm going to, my marriage is going to succeed, and I'm going to, endure whatever to make it work. So I was surprised. The closer I got towards my divorce, the more I realized the most respectful thing, because that's what this headship, it's all about respect, which is not, of course we all want respect, but if your relationship is functioning like an employee boss relationship, that is not a love relationship. That is not being equally yoked. And it's not anything that anybody wants, fundamentally. Like they might get drunk on the power in the short term, even if they're not imposing it, they'll reap the benefits of it, but it's not fulfilling their, it's a toxic dynamic. So one of the things that was surprising to me in my spirit was to discover that if you are all about respect that head, trying to convince them or motivate them or manipulate them in some subtle passive way to doing the right thing, it's all controlling. The most respectful thing you can do is say, this is what I believe, this is what I think should be happening, and if it's not, then the most respectful thing that you can do is to walk away. And especially if they are behaving in a self-destructive way, having that consequence and that boundary to say, you are self-destructing. I care about you. I love you. I don't want you to self-destruct. However, you are a free agent. You're a separate human being, and you are free to choose to self-destruct, but you are not free to drag me into your self-destruction. I am ultimately yoked to God, and he is my head, not you. And there's a verse in Corinthians that says that the people that are married should be behaving as if they are not. And I think it should be obvious to Christians that that's not saying that, you are indifferent to your spouse and you treat them as if you're not married. It is that if there is a conflict between you and your spouse to where, they are insisting on doing, something that's self-destructive. And I say it that way because preachers always say, oh, well, if they're, like Bonnie and Clyde asking you to sin, then it's very clear that you don't do that. But the self-destructive things are so much more subtle. It's not obvious you're being dragged into sins. Even though I didn't know the depth of the deception or the breadth of the deception, I didn't even know everything that was involved. I could clearly see that my husband was self-destructing. I had no idea that he was just never faithful to me in heart. So when somebody is, getting involved in addictions or, shutting down emotionally or checking out or whatever, all these like destructive things, they're free to do that. And you're not obligated out of, this headship to follow them into that. And, that's where, the internal, I would call it theological abuse comes, because I'm like, what God joined together, you don't separate. God hates divorce. And I'm like, these aren't necessarily things. Obviously, I've heard them in the outside Christian world, but nobody was beating me up about those things like I was.
Yeah, so, and I hear you. While you were saying all that, I was thinking, that was me while I was married too. I was very much married for life, even after multiple affairs, and the pastor said, hey, you don't have to divorce after adultery. You could respect your husband and stay married. But the point is that I didn't respect myself enough to walk away and say, I need to do what's best for me in divorce and stop allowing myself to be sinned against every time he had an affair. And it's interesting, towards the end of my marriage, I contacted one of my longtime friends, really solid Christian woman, and I was telling her kind of what was going on. And I said, I think I feel like I'm worshiping my husband. And she said, that's not how God intended marriage to be. You're not supposed to worship your husband. You're supposed to be still worshiping God. And it was that point that I realized that, I had taken headship the wrong way. And I had put my husband in that position where only God should be.
Hearing you say that, it just reminds me, I was fortunate enough that during my marriage, we lived in New York City, so I got to see Tim Keller preach, and he has the book Counterfeit Gods, and he was preaching messages from that, and essentially the message is that the human heart is just going to naturally worship something. And it can be something really bad, like typically when we think of idolatry, we're thinking of, something that's like just obviously a false god, that you're bowing down to a statue, or, maybe you're a slave to drugs or something like that. Like that's kind of where Christians go when they hear that type of thing. But what I really liked about Tim Keller's message on this topic is that he was emphasizing that we can make idols out of anything, even good things. And that can include church, that can include family, and it can include marriage. So I had those ideas also in my brain as I was, trying to make sense out of everything and how to have a godly marriage where my husband was just like completely checked out. And in my mind at the time, that was masculinity. And it's like, I was never attracted to the strong silent type, but anytime I complain about it, they're like, well, you were attracted to the strong silent type, so no, you don't get to complain about that in marriage. Like he's able to be checked out and stone-faced as much as he wants, and you can't complain. I'm like, okay, that's God's design. I have to accept him where he's at. And I do have to say, I don't regret my decision to try to love him where he was at, and accept him at that level. Because at the time, I didn't know that, he had a double life. That, when you talk about narcissism presenting an image, he gave me like a fabricated image of himself. So our marriage was an illusion. There was no marriage. He was shopping for other options from the very early days of the marriage. He was never married to me.
That's a really good point, though, that I see in a lot of women, that they kind of felt like their marriage to a narcissist was a fraud the whole time,
Yeah.
that it was just about their image. And I know for myself too, I found out my ex-husband was on Friend Finder the first month of our marriage and looking for other women. And I thought, wow, why? I was just so shocked. Like, you have a wife now. Why do you need to be out looking? And I think that just comes from lack of contentment with the narcissist heart, that they're just always looking for something better and to make their image look better. And so, and women on the reverse side can create a codependent type relationship. And the men do it too. Narcissists definitely enjoy a codependent woman who can't, function on her own, and he certainly can't function on his own. But we have to then break that cycle at some point. I think that's where it ended in me. I just thought, I don't want to be in a codependent relationship with my husband. I'm not a codependent person. Like, I don't fit that title of codependent, but somehow I ended up in this relationship, affair after affair after affair, staying, caring more about his salvation and his, walk with God and his purity and all those things than myself. And it took for me being diagnosed with lupus to say, I'm killing myself staying in this marriage. My body is not healthy because I spent all these years trying to make somebody else better who didn't want to be better.
I want to thank Jen Grice for her time. We had such a great conversation. I've edited it into segments to make it more easily digestible. So I hope you'll join us again next week, where we continue the conversation on the wrong ways to give headship. In the meantime, I hope you have a great week. I look forward to seeing you next week. God bless.